Have you played Final Fantasy IV? Let's check it out. You are watching Laz TV. Final Fantasy IV was released in Japan on the Super Famicom system in 1991. It was also released in North America in 1991 under the name Final Fantasy II. That's because we didn't get the original Final Fantasy II or III until much, much later. An interesting feature released in this game was the active time battle system, where some characters and enemies were faster and would attack more often than other characters or enemies. The North American version was made less difficult because the developers felt that the Japanese version was just too hard for audiences here across the pond. This game gives me a lot of memories of renting it at a video game store, but have you played Final Fantasy IV? Have you played Final Fantasy V? Let's check it out. Oh, you're watching Laz TV. Final Fantasy V was released in Japan in 1992, but didn't make its way over to the West until later anthologies, and that's because the game developers thought it was too difficult for Western audiences. The active time battle system returns in Final Fantasy V, as does the job system, which was originally introduced in Final Fantasy III. The refined job system allowed a level of customization for your characters that hadn't been seen in a Final Fantasy game to date. Final Fantasy V made its North American debut in 1999 for the PlayStation as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology Collection. If you like Final Fantasy, come hang out with me tonight on Twitch at 8 p.m. PST. Have you played Final Fantasy VI? Hee, you're watching Laz TV. Released in Japan as Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy III in North America back in 1994, this game is considered one of the greatest RPGs for a console system of all time. Set in a world of steampunk fantasy, Final Fantasy VI featured 14 playable characters and one of the best villains in all of video game history, Kefka. Final Fantasy VI had a lot of party customization. They added relics, which allowed characters to use special moves, as well as the Esper system, which let every character use summons and magic. If any game deserves a remake like the one they did for Final Fantasy VII, it's absolutely Final Fantasy VI. So, have you played Final Fantasy VI?